we go. There we go. Morning, everyone. Good day to be here, am I right? All right, so before I get started in the sermon proper, I do want to say just one or two things. How much I appreciate everybody who has been in this church and has helped me get to where, basically wasn't with God at all to standing up here preaching. It's been pretty amazing, so I just want to thank you. Come to music mentors or pastorally mentors or just mentors in general. I really appreciate all of you who have helped me get here. Secondly, of course, start off the sermon. Love Pastor Eddie. Been a great mentor. So, of course, I got to start out with, yes. Been a great mentor. So, of course, I got to pick at him a little bit, right? So, when I was first given this verse to go off of by Pastor Eddie, the whole I come to bring division. When I was first given that, I was kind of baffled a little bit. Because, as we were, as was highlighted in the children's story, when we hear division, you don't really think of it as a good thing. So I was kind of like, how is Jesus, and how does that work, right? It didn't make sense to me. The other thing was, I was thinking to myself, this is my first sermon ever. And this is what you give me? So, and nothing immediately jumped out at me. Nothing was very apparent to start with, right? I wasn't, I didn't hear I come to bring division. And I was like, that's my direction. I was more like, So it took some time and actually really getting into Luke and specifically this chapter and reading through it before I actually was able to realize what these words of division meant. So the reason I was primarily confused is when we think of Jesus, we think of the ultimate good guy, the ultimate, Prince of Peace, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, all these adjectives, right, to describe him. And him bringing division just didn't make sense. Because how is the perfect person going to bring division? How is that, what does he mean by that, right? So when I really started reading this, I realized if we believe Jesus to be the ultimate good, how can he come to bring division? So that brings me to the A, address. I want to do two things with this. First is I want to address the timeline of when this is taking place. What's happening around Jesus at the time. Second is, who is Jesus himself addressing? Who is he talking to when he says this? And learning that actually brought a lot. First is who he's addressing. In this, earlier in the chapter of Luke, if you're familiar with it, it says that there was a crowd, but he says he was first addressing the disciples. He was addressing the disciples that were right here with him, and he was saying, this is what you need to hear first. Because all these other people can hear it too, but I'm talking to you specifically. He was addressing the disciples. And actually earlier in this chapter, he also is talking about the timeline itself, what's happening around. We're all familiar with the Pharisees. Pharisees. So we're familiar with the Pharisees. This was kind of already in the middle of when the Pharisees had tried to stir stuff up with Jesus. They weren't trying to murder him yet, but they weren't happy with him. So eventually, he says this in Luke chapter 12, verse 1 through 3. Meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands had gathered, so that they were trampling on one another, Jesus began to speak first to his disciples, saying, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What you have said in the dark will be heard in the daylight, and what you have whispered in the ear of the inner room will be proclaimed from the roofs. So, to me, what this is saying is, listen, these Pharisees, they could quote you every law in the book. But they were reading that and so focused on that Jesus was not the Messiah they had prayed for. He was an obstacle. He was in their way, basically, of their control over these people. This is where I'm going to highlight the B of our ABCs today. Would you have to stick with me on this just for a minute? B is burden. When Jesus said he comes to bring division, he was not referring to starting a conflict as some at the time thought he was. There were people at the time that were saying, Jesus, you're going to take a sword up and go fight everybody. And he's like, no, this is not what I'm doing. This is not what I'm here for. He wasn't coming there to violently take over and start a war. And he also wasn't coming to bring peace in the way a lot of them expected him to do. And a lot of people, you'll hear this now a lot of times. Jesus was not coming there saying, oh, it's okay. Keep doing what you're doing. You're fine. Keep trying to stone every sinner in the room, but forget about yourself. That's not what he was saying. He wasn't saying, just keep doing that. No, it's not what he was doing. He's coming to bring division, and, don't you just love when God, gives a wink at you? You know what I'm talking about? As I'm listening to Pastor Eddie tell our bullywink story, I'm like, yep. So, he's coming to set the stage. Part of Jesus' mission when he was here was to prepare his disciples for when he left, to set the standards and set his expectations for what you are to do. Okay? Now, what I mean by this is when I say the B is burden, I am referring to when he tells his disciples, deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow me. We each have a burden on ourselves when we decide to follow Jesus. Now, for everybody, it's different. Everybody's going to have that one thing that they just kind of can't get rid of. And I know it's different for everybody. Maybe, you have this anger that's inside of you that you just can't seem to shake. Or, it can go all the way to things like addiction. But you have a burden because of what Jesus has given you and told you, listen, this is your standard that you are to follow. When you have a standard to follow, you have a goal. That's why, when I tell people, what's the point of being a Christian? Be as much like Jesus as you can, because you're never going to be perfect, but be as much as like you can, and bring as many people with you as you can. That's your two main goals. So that's what I mean when I say burden, okay? And we get a very good example of this. He came to divide, which I love. Again, Reverend Bullywake knows a thing or two. When he comes to divide, he comes to separate. Now, what is he separating exactly? Well, when he's coming here to divide people, he's not coming here to incite petty conflicts. He's not coming here saying, oh, their shoes are the green suede shoes over there, they don't look too nice, do they? Or his tie is crooked or whatever. That's not what he's doing. He's not coming here to divide people in that sense and start petty conflicts. He's coming here to set people apart. He's going to come in here and say, this is the standard to follow. These are the people that are following. These are the ones who are not. And more accurately, these are the people who are and the people who think they are. So, now, who is he discussing in this? Don't be a Pharisee. What I mean by that, I don't think any of you are going to try to murder Jesus. I don't think that. I would hope not. I would hope if Jesus walked through the store, none of you are going to be like, throw rocks at him. I would hope that's not the case. What I mean by don't be a Pharisee is don't be so focused on something else or, so focused on asking God to do things your way that you don't see it when it happens because it doesn't look like the way you thought it would. one of my favorite stories as an example of that is a little parable I heard a long, long time ago. There was this guy, in the lower parts of Florida. He was in his house, and a hurricane was coming. It was going to be a bad one. And, as they're getting ready, he sees a Hummer from the National Guard go by his house. And like, hey, man, come on, we'll get you out of here. We'll get you somewhere safe. I was like, nah, I'm good. God will protect me. So hurricane comes, starts flooding his house. It gets pretty bad. He's like, standing on the counters and stuff, getting out of the water. And then a Coast Guard boat goes by. Hey, hop on the boat. We'll get you out of here. No, God will save me. Fast forward a little bit, he ends up on the roof of his house because the flooding has gotten so bad, he's now on the roof to stay out of it. And a helicopter goes overhead and says, hey, get on, we'll get you out of here. He says, no, my God will save me. Well, he then unfortunately passes away. And when he gets to heaven, he's like, what was that? I told everybody you're going to save me, right? God was like, I sent you 3 ways. I sent you 3 different ways to get out of there, and you took none of them. But because it's not what he thought it would look like, he didn't take it. Now, another thing that I really want to highlight, knowing God trumps quoting God. I felt a lot of you stand up a little straighter, sit up a little straighter when I said that. What I mean by this, the disciples were not really good people. Most of them weren't. You had tax collectors, you had old crusty fishermen and all that, right? Not looking at anybody in here, if that's what you're thinking. That's not what I'm doing. You had these people that weren't necessarily good people. They weren't the priests. They weren't the scholars. They were just normal people, or sometimes less than normal. I mean, when people walk by, they'd say, hanging out with the tax collector guy? What's this guy up to? Or story of Zacchaeus. I know he wasn't a disciple, but Jesus was like, come out, I want to talk to you. And he called him out specifically. He didn't talk to any of the Pharisees and say, hey, I want to talk to you. But when Zacchaeus, the tax collector, was in the tree, he said, come down, I want to talk to you. Also goes back to the whole who needs a hospital, the needy or the sick. The well or the sick, rather. The Pharisees were so focused on knowing everything that they could know, quoting every prophecy, quoting every verse law of the hundreds they had. And they were so busy praying for the Messiah to free them from, come down and slay everyone else and make us the right rulers or whatever. They were so focused on praying about that when Jesus was at their doorstep, they didn't know him. Does that ever cross your mind? When you think about the story of the Pharisees, they were so busy praying that the Messiah would show up that when he was there, he's like, they were like, who's this guy? Who's this guy? They didn't realize that he was standing right in front of them. And I can say personally from my life, there have been times where I was so busy praying for something to happen one way that I didn't notice when it went the other way. That's happened to me. So that is what I'm talking about when I say knowing God trumps quoting God is, listen, if you come to church every Sunday, every Wednesday, whatever, that's great. That's awesome. You probably have a pretty good head knowledge of God. But I'm going to be real with you. I wouldn't look the other way, honestly. Because I care much more about, and more importantly, God cares much more about if you know him rather than just knowing what he said in the specific wording that you can quote it down to the semicolons. Because here's the deal. If you can quote the entire Bible, but you can't tell me what it means, what's the point? If you can quote the whole thing front to back, but you don't know the heart behind it, you don't know the God behind it that made it, there's no point. There's no point. Because if you don't have the heart, the head knowledge means nothing. Now, C of our ABCs today. It's conform. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Romans 12:2. Do not conform to the expectations of the world. When I was really trying to think about this sermon, I knew it was coming for a while, and I was really racking my brain on it. It was so hard for me to see, how can Jesus bring something of division? And I realized that it's the way he wants us to behave. He wants us to be divided or set apart from the world. He brought in an era of division, not of division of each other, but to divide the follower of Jesus from everyone else. The follower of Jesus from maybe the Christian. The follower of Jesus from everything else over here, right? So when I was reading through this, do not conform, just trying to figure out what to talk about. To me, there's a couple ways to really go with that. Do not conform to the expectations of the world is pretty easy to say, if your friends are going to go out partying and drinking, or, going to go do something they shouldn't be doing, don't go with them. Even if they think you're not cool. I love to tell the story about my mom when she was a teenager, because she had a fellow classmate come up to her in high school. She said, "How do you have fun without drinking?" My mom thought about it for a second. I said, "Well, I find other ways to have fun, and I remember what I did." Love to tell that story. Because that was an example where my mom was set apart in a good way, because she was different, and people asked. Because if you live life different, people ask. If you are going through a terrible time, but you can see, that you've still got the peace and joy that God gives you, people notice that. If your family's if you've lost somebody, if you're going through a hard time economically, anything, and I'm good, God's got this. Your coworkers, your family, people around you will notice that, and it'll spark a question in their mind, a question that could lead them to eventually meet Jesus for themselves. Because if they see you, then they see Jesus, and that's what they should see. I like the expression, "You may be the only Bible someone reads." Do not conform, but be transformed. So when that's talking about, do not conform, but be transformed. For me, repentance is the main thing that comes to mind. Now, I'm not pointing to the sides of the room, which may be very clear about that. I'm not pointing to say one side's the sinners, okay? I'm staying on the stage here. Not pointing at Pastor Eddie either, okay? This is the way you're walking when you're not with Jesus, right? Repentance is not, I'm going to think about Jesus and I'm just going to keep walking this way. Repentance is not, I'm going to look this way at Jesus and keep walking this way, right? It's, you have to make a 180 and walk this way, everything going this way. Now, you see, here's the problem. If you try to walk this way, but you're looking that way, what's going to happen? You're going to fall on your face. And if you're following Jesus, but you're looking back at the way, oh, that was pretty fun, I should go do that again, you're going to fall on your face. You can't be in the middle. You have to be fully focused on it. That's repentance, and that's being set apart. And that's the kind of faith that people will notice. Now, this one, I know for me, and for some others, may be a little rough. Do not conform to the identity that your family tries to put on you. Now, what I don't mean is if your mom took you to Sunday school every week, don't conform to that. That's a good thing. It's something that should happen. What I mean is if your family comes from a line of addiction, or your family comes from a line of criminal activity, or just generally ungodly behavior, you don't have to follow that. Okay? Because I got some pretty interesting trivia for you. Jesus, that guy's good, right? You all know that. Jesus is a pretty good dude. Look at his lineage. Look at his lineage. Because there were some that were really good. There were some that were not. A lot of them were not. And a lot of them flip-flop back and forth because they made mistakes, because they were human. You know, I like to say David was a man after God's own heart, and look what he did. But the difference was that David knew what he did, and he chose to not follow it anymore. That's the difference. So, my word for you today is if your family comes from a place of addiction, or your family comes from a place of ungodly behavior, or even just comes from a place of being atheist, you don't have to follow that. You don't have to be what your past or your history says you should be. Which, to add on to that, it only runs in the family till it runs into you. That's the way to explain that. And be the one to say no. Now, promise I'm almost done. You got one more thing to say. When I was trying to figure out a direction for this sermon, I was racking my brain. I was trying to figure out, I was like, what am I going to do with this? What am I going to do with this? I don't know how to do this. I've never preached before. I don't know what division. What is division? Why? I don't know what to do here. And I was racking my brain. And this was like 11 o'clock at night. I was pacing in my room. I was like, what am I going to do here? I don't know what I'm doing. What am I going to, help. I don't know what I'm doing here, right? And then I was finally like, you know what? I'm done. I laid down. Head was on the pillow, eyes closed. And you guys know, the Frankenstein movies, how he, sits up straight in the bed? That's what I did. I'm not joking. I went like this because it popped into my head right then. And I was like, you were just waiting for me to shut up, weren't you? The word that I got was, a lot of people will make the comparison between Adam and Jesus. Some people go as far to even say that Jesus was the second Adam. So what I got was this. The devil brought division in the garden to separate man from God. And when Jesus showed up, he brought division to separate man from the devil and to give us a way out. Say, listen, I get it. I've lived life as a human. I've been tempted in every way that you have. I get it. This is your way out. If you follow me, if you follow my tenets, you believe me and you love me, then you'll live in paradise with me forever. So, as you go today, because I don't know if worship team's coming back or what's happening, because we changed up order the day I was coming up here, because why not, right? So, as I'm wrapping up, you choose what you follow. You choose what you're going to be. Every day you have to wake up and make a choice to follow God and to deny yourself. And it's not easy to make. But it is possible. There's a way, a truth, and a life. So, I just hope you choose to follow that today. Thank you for your time.
That was beautiful. I love it, 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 love it.